Good evening and welcome everyone to the WSRP Bistro Cafe. We've been experimenting with different venues all year, and here is yet another one for convivial intellectual exchange. And I want to thank Liz Sutton for being the organizer of this evening's setup. My name is Joan Branham, and I'm acting director of the Women's Studies and Religion program, standing in for my friend and colleague, Ann Browdy, who is with us tonight. I'm pleased to welcome all of you to the fourth lecture in the WSRP Works in Progress series. As you may know, the Women's Studies and Religion program is a wonderfully rich program here at HDS. Every year there are 5 research associates who are appointed to come here to pursue their work in a field dealing with women and religion. They also teach a course enhancing the HDS curriculum and deliver a talk during the year. I want to also just mention our next talk. There we go. Is from Ronit Irshai, and she will be speaking on April 1st, and I just want to point that out because there was a date change on that. So it's going to be at the same place, CSWR, across the street at 5:15, but on April 1st, and she will be speaking on her project toward building a gender-critical approach to the philosophy of halakha, or Jewish law. Today, I'm very happy to introduce to you Professor Michelle Molina. Michelle is an assistant professor of trans-regional religion in the Department of History at the University of California, Irvine. And this year at HDS, she is visiting assistant professor of women's studies and history of Christianity. Michelle received her doctorate from University of Chicago in 2004, where she studied religion and colonialism, and in particular the history of colonial Latin America. Her dissertation was entitled Visions of God, Visions of Empire, Jesuit Spirituality and Colonial Government. She has received a number of fellowships and grants to Rome and Spain to conduct her research, and in 2006, Michelle was a fellow at Harvard University in the Atlantic History Seminar. This year, Michelle's project, The Jesuit Ethic, the Spirit and Gender of Global Expansion, seeks to examine spiritual agency and the contribution of women's devotional labor in the history of early modern global expansion. She has already brought some of this work into the classroom, and she taught a course in the fall entitled Gender and Embodiment in the Expansion of Christianity. Today, Michelle has entitled her lecture, A Heart-Shaped World, Jesuit Consolation Culture in a Globalizing World from 1500 to 1800. Please welcome Michelle Molina.
There I am. Thank you, Joan. Thank you very much. I wanted to thank Joan, our intrepid leader, and also the Women's Studies and Religion Fellows who have just really provided such wonderful friendship and fellowship this year. It's really been a fantastic place to be. And of course, Liz, who put this whole thing together. Where's Liz now? Liz in the back. Everybody loves the format. Awesome. And some of the students that I taught last semester are here, so thank you very much for coming. That last semester was very fun and very helpful for me. I don't know what you guys got out of it. I came up with the title in the fall and hoped that by the time I got to this point, I could live up to the title. I am going to live up to the part that says Heart-Shaped World, Jesuit, Globalizing World. The consolation culture aspect is something that I'm working on through the rest of the book, but it doesn't come out strongly in today's paper. So I hope nobody's unduly disappointed. We could talk about it afterwards if we all need to be consoled about that. So let me make sure I can actually see my paper. For some time now, I've been preoccupied with drawing connections between the history of Western subjectivity and the history of early modern global expansion. Specifically, I'm intrigued by a dynamic between self and other in Western Christian culture, by which engagement with spiritual self-reform animated the desire to reform colonial others. The period I cover is roughly 1500 to 1800. And in a nutshell, I explore how new ways of thinking about self and world were key components of Jesuit evangelical efforts. By placing women's devotional labor within a transatlantic network of devotional practices, I am working to situate these female subjects, as well as the history of Mexico, smack within the account of the development of modern forms of subjectivity. So what I'm going to do today is walk you through some of the themes that I address in my research, how I've been working to develop a history that links women's spiritual agency to a story about epistemological transformation, and how this in turn has pushed me to look more closely at early modern devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. I hope to give you a sense of how the language and practice of Catholic spiritual self-reform provides rich ground for theorizing the self, as well as for developing a historical understanding of how individual Catholics experienced self in the early modern world. We know the contours of the story of Protestant asceticism, but very little about parallel developments in the Catholic world, about Catholic forms of interiority, and about Catholic worldly asceticism. If I can convince you of anything by the end of this talk, it will be the following. Interiority is not only Protestant. Reform is not only post-Enlightenment. Both of these belong properly to the history of Christianity writ large. What we need is a better understanding of how, when, and for whom they became socially and culturally viable ways of acting on the self and imagining the world. So the answer that I will sketch today points to work that monastics performed in accomplished in perfecting and practicing Catholic techniques of the self throughout the medieval period. And these well-honed methods of self-scrutiny reached an expanded audience when Jesuit spiritual practices made them available to a very responsive Catholic laity, not only in Europe, but also in Latin America. Remember what we need? Okay. I offer this as a triptych of sorts. The quote and the images that you see here serve as touchstones that I worry with now and then. I utilize them to re-anchor the minutiae of archival findings, empirical detail, etc., within this broad sweep of the story that I want to tell about how self and world were connected, how individual efforts at spiritual personal transformation had global significance, that in turn led to epistemological transformations in Western thought and practice. So I begin with this quote by Arnold Davidson. He writes, "In trying to capture the different forms in which care of the self has appeared, it is essential to understand not only the ways in which the self became an object of concern, but also the ways in which one went beyond oneself, relating the self to something grander than itself." Now, much of my research prods at archival materials that hold clues as to how individual Catholics in Latin America experienced Jesuit methods of spiritual perfection. But I also pay attention to how spiritual care of the self oriented one's relationship with a world that was, in this time period, rapidly expanding. And here you can actually see what I mean when I say that Jesuit spirituality reached an expanded audience. This image captures the scope that the Jesuit order had founded in 1542, the scope that it had reached by the mid-17th century. I'll get it a little bit closer for you. Now what I see when I look at this image is a link between the self-reform and the reform of others. We can locate Ignatius there at the bottom of the trunk, Rome there, the center of the Catholic world, and then you follow the trunk and the branches up and out, the many branches that depict how his conversion affected the expansion of the Society of Jesus. The Jesuit provinces across the globe are represented by these sundials. With each leaf, all these various leaves, represents the name of towns that had a Jesuit college. Now the markings and engravings on the side are decorated with the words from east to west, praiseworthy is the name of God, printed in all the languages in which the Jesuits preached or taught. And behind Ignatius here, back there, are ships on the verge of departure, signifying an active spirituality, or as the 16th century Jesuits put it best themselves, we are not monks, the world is our home. Now the Jesuit, whoops, I put in. Come back. Let's see. Help. I can keep going on. I can go on. The Jesuit polymath Athanasius Kircher included this image in a 1646 treatise on light, in acknowledgement that although he wrote his book from the Library and Museum in Rome, he had a long-standing debt to his Jesuit brethren, who had observed various scientific phenomena from their missionary stations around the globe. Now, although the recent surge in studies about Jesuits has focused quite a bit on the Society of Jesus' role in the development of the sciences, there has been remarkably little on the science of the self found in the meditative techniques of the Ignatian spiritual exercises. Oh, thanks, Liz. That's pretty rapid. See why we like Liz? So I just want to tell you that originally my interest in these techniques of the self or practices of the self grew out of an engagement with literature on the culture of colonialism, a field dominated by the study of the British Empire. I'm not going to spend a lot of time today on post-colonial studies, but it's important to understanding the shape that of my resulting research, that as a Latin Americanist, I was completely perplexed by the absence of questions about Spain's 300 years of colonial cultural hegemony. Now, part of this can be explained as a problem of timing. Post-colonial studies took off during the 1990s, virtually at the same moment when scholars were composing quincentennial reconsiderations of the import of 1492. This convergence meant that colonial studies engaged Latin America as a site of contact and conquest. And within that literature, Latin America remained frozen in this 16th century moment. But an even more profound roadblock to getting these two colonialisms to speak to each other was that colonial studies had been structured upon arguments about the Enlightenment project in its overseas iterations. The inability to consider the relevance of the culture of Latin American colonialism lay in religion itself. Spain was written off as a religious enterprise, read Catholic, irrational, backward, not one grounded in science and reform. As a field, post-colonial studies evolved and flourished upon the fundamental principle that 19th century colonialism had taken a modern turn. So to paraphrase the words of critical theorist David Scott, modern colonialism was a civilizing project that shaped and governed, quote, the capacities, competencies, and wills of the governed. Colonial governmentality, Scott writes, is about the conduct of conduct. But if we look at the specific forms of subjectivity that Jesuit missionaries sought to inculcate in colonial Mexico, we see that if the conduct of conduct is to be the measure, then colonialism took a modern turn early. And so I look at these early modern forms of Catholic subjectivity via the Ignatian spiritual exercises. A bit about the exercises. This was a spiritual practice that had both personal and social reform very clearly in its sights. Ignatius wrote that the method and purpose of the exercises was, quote, to overcome oneself and to order one's life without reaching a decision through some disordered affection. Composed in the 1520s and published formally in the 1540s, the exercises were written in a very functional manner, as a series of instructions, details, and suggestions for the Jesuit director, who assisted another person through the course. Ignatius presented the exercises as a program to be carried out over 4 weeks. I'm afraid to put this down. Each appropriately labeled week 1, week 2, and so on, with each week comprising a series of meditative exercises that would be built on and expanded in the ensuing weeks. Now, 2 critical components of the first week were the particular examination of conscience and the general confession. This image of the hand is taken from a 17th century copy of the Jesuit spiritual exercises, an illustrated copy. The palm is inscribed with a reminder that one's soul is in one's own hand. It's suggested as a mnemonic device. It was handy, as it were, for carrying meditative practice into everyday life. The image does not merely represent the exacting self-scrutiny, attention to soul and self advocated by the spiritual exercises. The hand provides itself as a physical technique, an embodied method of self-evaluation. One could swiftly look to the hand and run through the appropriate steps for examining one's conscience. And those would be giving thanks to God first, and then asking for guidance from the Holy Spirit. And then you make an examination of conscience, and you, in this image, the man there is writing down his examination of conscience. And then the next step is to make a painful confession. And then this is just a handy reminder to flee from sin. Now, attaining the ability to evaluate one's entire life was an essential goal of the first week. Consider this late 16th century expansion on Ignatius's points for making the examination of conscience. This is another Jesuit wrote this at the turn of the 17th century. Consideration of oneself. Tuesday, points. Consideration of self and time and place. Where are you? Who are you? Also reflection on each phase of his life. The time, the place, the state of life, circumstances in which he then lived as a sinner in each period, the things he happened to witness, and how swiftly and unmindfully everything passed by. His state of mind then and now. This short, dense passage is completely absent ornamental flourish. Each phase demanded a serious response from the exercitant, leading to a narrative account of one's life. Now, Brian Stock, in particular, has shown how narrative memory exercises were used as a means of being and becoming, comparing such exercises to an advanced literary exercise. He says it was a re-editing of the self in which one narrative, a life to come, was traced over another, a life already lived. So attaining the ability to evaluate one's entire life was an essential goal of the first week, which culminated in making this general confession. That's in the middle point, your general confession. There's your general confession, but you're writing your general confession there. And here this idea of a general confession was intended to jumpstart the conversion process by inculcating a comprehensive understanding of the role of sin in one's life. Now, rather than merely listing sins committed since the last confession, the mental exercise of considering sin committed over a lifetime encouraged the practitioner to develop the ability to recognize enduring patterns of decision-making and narrate the effects of particular types of sin in one's life. Now, one then moved to from these introspective exercises of self-scrutiny to look outward, to imagine the world. In the Meditation on Two Standards, the practitioner was, quote, to see the great extent of the circuit of the world, with people so many and so diverse. I will see the various persons, some here, some there. First those on the face of the earth, so diverse in dress and behavior, some white, others black, some in peace, others at war, some weeping, others laughing, some healthy and some sick, and so on and so forth. I will listen to what the persons on the face of the earth are saying, that is, how they speak to one another, swear and blaspheme, and so on. Likewise, I will hear what the divine persons are saying, that is, let us work the redemption of the human race. The next exercise, one would see in the mind's eye that Satan's minions were already dispersed in the far-flung corners of the globe. Now, choosing the banner of Christ, one stood next to Jesus, positioned on the verge of departure, perhaps in one of those ships, upon a mission to save souls. Now, the entire program was a retreat. It took approximately 30 days to complete. An adapted program of 8 days swiftly became most popular among laity, who, as you might imagine, did not have 30 days for prayer and meditation. The Jesuits, known for their skills at adaptation, were known for their skills at adaptation, and the 16th century Jesuits tailored their exercises to accommodate a wide variety of needs. For businessmen, only a few hours in the morning. Women, caution, only publicly in the church, and no passing of notes allowed. Young boys, well, you draw upon the gory bits of Scripture to capture their attention. Now, by the 17th century, we witnessed what I call the birth of the retreat house. And this is a very interesting grassroots movement in which the laity themselves demanded more formal and institutionalized access to the spiritual exercises. Retreat houses were often funded by wealthy women who, after making the exercises themselves, felt called to make the 8-day version of the retreat available either to other women, impoverished men, soldiers, servants, and so on. By the late 17th century, publications of devotional guides directed women how to make the exercises in the home. And by the 18th century, publications in Nahuatl, one of the primary native languages in New Spain, directed the father of the household in making the exercises with his family at home. And this Naha publication mentions that manuscript versions of this same text had been circulating since the late 17th century, at least in Mexico City. So alone, undertaking the spiritual exercises or reading in private devotion, not just Jesuits, but many individual Catholics labored to reform their own lives and to achieve salvation by building toward what the Society of Jesus deemed the fulfillment of history, the formation of a universal Christian empire. Via Jesuit devotional practices, Catholics imagined the world. For example, New Spaniards had a vision of life in Asia that centered upon the stories of Christian missionaries and converts who had been martyred in Japan. To offer one small but powerful illustration of imagined community, laymen and women in 17th century Mexico City formed a congregation, an association centered on devotional life, and dedicated themselves to prayer for the martyred souls of a similar Jesuit congregation in Japan. The founding document described how these Mexican members were moved by the bravery and zeal of their Japanese brethren, quote, who risked losing their businesses, their haciendas, homes, and even their children. I like them imagining the haciendas in Japan. And who suffered the most cruel torments in defense of their faith, 8 of whom were burned alive. So referring back in your mind to this Davidson epigraph that I began with in my triptych, clearly the spiritual self was an object of concern for these members of this religious association. And yet they also went beyond, relating personal spirituality to a vision of this expanding Catholicism. Now, what I like to emphasize about the exercises is not what's new in them. John O'Malley calls them a scissors and paste composition, which simply means that Ignatius drew upon a long and wide history of monastic methods and practices when writing his exercises. Rather more important than novelty is the very fact that heretofore elite monastic practices were becoming available and popular among the laity of all walks of life. In other words, what's new in the exercises was not content, but audience. The laity was being monasticized, and critically, this movement converged with early modern European expansion, a moment in which ideas about sin and self percolated through a newly connected world. So what does it mean to be monasticized? To offer an extremely rough gloss, during the medieval period, Hellenistic techniques of the self took a Christian turn when they were further developed and preserved in the Catholic monastery. But most scholars follow Max Weber's lead. He recognized Catholic rationality in its monastic form, yet denied it any social efficacy, instead leaving these technologies of the self to languish on a remote mountaintop. Now, by contrast, the history of the Ignatian exercises tells an important story of how Catholic technologies of the self emerged from the monastery and compelled the practitioner, both lay and religious, to develop a view of the self active in this very world. Jesuit techniques of the self were widespread and popular. As such, a more individualistic and worldly approach to spirituality resulted not only because there was something new called Protestantism to consider, but also because Catholic spiritual practices conditioned laity to think of themselves in a new light. Now, Michel Foucault helped us to begin to see aspects of this history when he pointed out that the roots of Catholic Reformation demands for more frequent confession belong to the longue durée of monastic tradition. As he explained it, the rules of the Catholic confession, rooted in ascetic and monastic settings, became, by the 17th century, quote, a rule for everyone. Yet, quite similar to the way in which Max Weber left Catholic rationality burrowed away in a remote monastery, Foucault dismissed this rule for everyone as an ideal only, articulated at the discursive level. He commented, "It would seem in actual fact that it could scarcely have applied to any but a tiny elite, the great majority of the faithful who only went to confession on rare occasions. In the course of the year, surely escaped such complex prescriptions." So instead, Foucault differentiated between this invention of moral and theological techniques of introspection and periodized these as beginning to become important but not expansive in the 17th century. And his calendar of diffusion, which he marked as psychoanalytical and scientific in nature, and belonging more properly to the turn of the 19th century. But let's consider my touchstone images. These engravings illustrate a simultaneity in the development and dispersion of techniques of the self, a global dispersion at that. So ruminating on the nature of Foucault's so-called rupture between these two disparate conditions of possibility for self-formation, this has led me to shift the emphasis of my project. I began this inquiry concerned to establish that Jesuit techniques and practices of spiritual self-transformation in New Spain ought to be interpreted as a form of colonial governmentality. It seemed imperative to point to parallels between this early modern Mexican history with arguments about post-Enlightenment concerns with the conduct of conduct. That by framing Mexico within a history of transatlantic Catholicism, we would see how the dynamics of colonial power converged with the spiritual work that one performed on the self, and appreciate how Latin Americans grappled with trends that shaped the emergence of modern selves. Now, these points still remain a very important part of the book that I'm writing. But Foucault's depiction of a historical disjuncture has also led me to experiment methodologically with ways of connecting individual spiritual self-transformation with large-scale phenomena of epistemological transformation. So the question is then, does this early modern diffusion of moral and theological practices, does it shed any light on the nature of the transition from one episteme to the next? Now I'm going to illustrate this methodological shift by adding a few more extremely complex and technical images to the mix. Brace yourself. This first image represents one of the fundamental tenets of history, a narrative of change over time. The second, a circle, is meant to signify a synchronic view, a snapshot that no matter the variety of analytical tools utilized, basically captures the structure and function of social, cultural, linguistic, epistemic systems, so on. Bourdieu might be offered as paradigmatic. His concepts of habitus and field are utilized to map out dynamic systems. The squiggly lines mean dynamic, right? That are nonetheless captured synchronically. And I put his little line down there at the bottom. The squiggly lines are the structured structures predisposed to function as structuring structures. This is a snapshot of a culture, a system in freeze frame. Now, some scholars do use these synchronic circles to describe change over time, to depict cultural transformation. They have to flesh out at least two and put them side by side. Here's before, here's after. See? Change. This photo album approach is basically what Foucault offered in The History of Sexuality, Volume 1. He pointed to the first picture, where the will to knowledge belonged to a moral theological framework, and then turned the page to the second snapshot, which captured the will to knowledge operating on scientific and psychoanalytic terms. Yet his theorizing did not explain the movement between them. So the question remains, how did this epistemological shift happen? How, speaking more generally, are concepts transformed? A history of ideas approach might follow a key philosopher like René Descartes and trace the impact of the spiritual exercises on this thinker who was educated at a Jesuit college, and perhaps draw connections between his ideas about controlling the passions with Ignatian methods for controlling oneself and ordering one's life. But I remain captivated by how these potentially transformative ideas circulated and percolated through Catholic society more generally. So I'm going to touch down now, as it were, to anchor some of these ideas in a concrete example. In brief, I want to suggest how personal spiritual transformation, how what I depict here as this circling back and deeper into the self, could indeed lead to the beginnings of epistemological transformation. So we kind of have the merging of all my fancy drawings. And in the next part of the talk, I'm going to switch gears a little to explore personal and epistemological transformation through the study of two Mexican nuns' correspondence with their Jesuit confessor. I share the first nun's spiritual journey to tell what I see as this personalized story of epistemological change, and a very truncated version of a second nun's letters I share with you to point in the direction I'm heading now with heart-centered devotional literature. Okay, shifting gears. While browsing through Jesuit materials in the Archivo General de la Nación in Mexico City, I called up a box called Miscellaneous, It was a very serendipitous find. Among other items in this folder, I chanced upon a set of letters written by a number of Mexican women to a Jesuit priest named Agustin Antonio Marquez. Left unmarked and unremarked upon, this body of correspondence was the product of the very close relationships that these women had with Padre Marquez, the director at the Jesuit Casa de Ejercicios, a retreat house attached to the Colegio de San Andres. The women's practice of letter writing continued the spiritual self-formation begun in the retreat house. And in the letters, as we'll see most specifically in the second case I discussed, the nuns utilized a language of the heart to describe cultivating the self as a project. Now, I'm particularly keen to understand how submission was practiced in the lives of spiritually minded Catholic women in the 18th century New Spain. Current literature on women's spiritual writing, with its emphasis on women's resistance to patriarchal norms, has offered little help. The women's letters to Father Marquez are remarkably different from the very structured autobiographic manuscripts or published life stories held to hagiographic conventions. The authors, I consider, wrote very informal letters, sometimes just short notes, that asked only for the spiritual attentions of their confessor and declared obedience to him. So if agency is construed primarily as resistance, how are we to make sense of these letters? There's no doubt that religious women's writing can be read productively to find moments of resistance to patriarchal norms. Nonetheless, much of this scholarship has been so preoccupied with reading between the lines that we have taken the bulk of what these women wrote to be superfluous. Are we unable to understand this language or just unwilling? So to understand early modern women's religiosity, I draw upon Saba Mahmood's critique of Western feminist notions of agency. She suggests that docility and submission can be a means of attaining greater mastery over the self. And it's in this spirit I investigate the desire to submit to the direction of a Jesuit confessor and explore the kinds of selves produced out of relationships that require docility. These Mexican letters, I argue, were a means of salvation, a practice of moral formation that was conducive to leading a life of virtue that ultimately was hoped would lead to eternal salvation. What these letters best convey was the nature and experience of spiritual transformation among early modern Catholic women. Further, a moment in history is revealed, for in Maria Josefa's struggle for virtue, we see something of the overlap or concurrence of Foucault's moral theological and psychological discourses of self. So now, in addition to these being first-person narratives of women who are most often absent from the historical record, these letters are of profound interest to me because the women wrote them after making the Jesuit spiritual exercises. Earlier, I discussed some of the narrative memory practices that were intended to help the practitioner of the exercises develop a narrative of self as a sinner. Perhaps you can now better understand the thrill of my archival find. I had in my hand letters written by women who had been instructed in this process of self-narration. Surely I was going to be reading fascinating stories, first-hand accounts of women's lives framed within the context of sin. There's no way to better convey my ultimate frustration than by introducing one of Father Marquez's regular correspondents. Maria Josefa was a nun from Mexico City whose very cryptic letters discussed her struggles to lead a life of virtue. The product of a confessional relationship, the letters disappoint the modern reader, and they never fully describe these afflictions and necessities that we are so accustomed to hearing in our own confessional culture. One can imagine that women feared invasions of privacy, especially the nuns who relied upon others to deliver their letters. And the woman that I talk about today, Maria Josefa, wrote just one letter just to check on the status of a prior letter. Had Father Marquez received it, for she sent the letter unaware that he was in retreat at the time. She expressed anxiety about the fact that the letter was left in another person's care. And to be sure, this hesitancy to be explicit was present in all of the letters from all the women that wrote to Father Marquez. In fact, in the entire corpus of letters, and in this box of letters, there were about maybe 20, 25 different women writing some just very short letters to him, one so short that said, "You told me to write to you after the exercises," and that's the extent of the... So she complied, but didn't keep up the correspondence. In this entire corpus of letters written to Marquez, the closest we get to narrativity might be the response letter that Maria Josefa wrote during the spiritual exercises. It was actually a letter addressed to Jesus. in which she summarized her day-by-day experiences. I passed day 1 and 2 in great struggle, as I was very tempted to be impure, and I was very involved in these thoughts. Although she offers no details about the exact nature of her impure thoughts, one could surmise, broadly speaking, that they were related to struggles with the vow of chastity. Now, while most nuns, excepting widows, were expected to be virgins when they entered the convent, the struggle for chastity also referred more broadly to efforts to maintain purity of mind. In fact, calming one's heart, settling the mind, these are all very much part of the struggle of a meditative practice. In the ensuing days, Maria Josefa was consumed by doubts about writing the very narrative under discussion. She expressed deep anxiety about putting words on paper, indicating that she struggled with writing because she did not know what the enemy, the devil, intended. Later, she had the spirit to write and give thanks, yet she was unable. This gave way to a horrible, impure temptation that completely immobilized her. So to appreciate the complexity of her agitation, we might consider that on the one hand, her spiritual goal was surrendering herself to God's will. Yet on the other hand, writing about herself could be construed as self-glorification that could lead to the sin of vanity. In fact, in spiritual guidebooks, self-love was considered the most common and pernicious hindrance to spiritual virtue. A better understanding, I think, of Maria Josefa's struggles is attained by examining Jesuit spiritual advice on the difficulties of instructing penitents in the arts of spiritual discernment. The opposite of vanity is humility, began the French Jesuit Jean in his Treatise on Prayer from the Heart. He insisted, "From this I conclude with St. Teresa that every flush of zeal and devotion which disturbs the harmonious disposition of the interior and troubles its peace is in no way characteristic of divine inspiration, but rather a mixture of self-love that slides in everywhere, that mixes in all and spoils all." Now, by contrast, he goes on to write that one could escape the clutches of self-love and seek humility through meditation and prayer. But even this was fraught with the dangers of self-love. This interior humiliation must likewise be exempt from bustle, sorrow, resentment against oneself. For not only do agitations unsettle the soul and solve nothing, they are likewise new faults, often more dangerous than the initial ones. Why? Because they arise from vexed self-love and pride, scandalized at seeing ourselves still so imperfect. So I think we need to grasp the complexity of submission and obedience as studied practice in order to appreciate the nature of Maria Josefa's moral torment. If we turn to Caussade once again, he wrote that humility of the heart did not consist of what he called blind submission, but rather, quote, a perfect submission in all and everywhere, always avoiding anything that can possibly offend and displease God. In other words, perfect submission required not blind abnegation of self, but an intense knowledge and scrutiny of self that one was also struggling to transcend. These efforts seem slightly contradictory, but I think Rebecca Lester captures this complex dynamic in her recent ethnography of contemporary Mexican nuns in Puebla, Mexico. She writes that for the modern nuns, surrender of the self is not a complete relinquishing of personal agency, but this nuanced renegotiation of this agency, characterized by the progressive externalizing of control and the internalizing of responsibility. I don't think it's anachronistic to read this back into the early modern period. Luis de la Puente, a Spanish Jesuit theologian, said much the same in his guides to mental prayer that were published and read in colonial Mexico. Meditation, he explained, ran along the two poles of knowledge of God and knowledge of oneself. Knowledge of God, knowledge of oneself. In between the two poles moves the machine of contemplation, wrote de la Puente. Meditation passing continually from one to the other, climbing like the angels up Jacob's ladder until the highest rung, where Jacob sleeps. And turning once again, one scales up and down the stairs of those discourses and meditations, in order to know well the good that belongs to God and his greatness, and at the same time that which is man and his misery. So this intricate movement between probing self-knowledge and complete surrender of self was corroborated again in Caussade's Treatise on Prayer. When advising penitents who may have experienced similar difficulties to Maria Josefa, he counseled them to treat one's own self with the charity and kindness one might offer a neighbor. In fact, to see oneself as other. This, he wrote, is the great secret for quickly acquiring great purity of conscience and in the meanwhile perfect knowledge of yourself and deep humility of the heart, founded on frequently experiencing our pitiable weakness. So whatever the nature of Maria Josefa's anxieties, she did not document the retreat. Instead, she wrote about her spiritual struggles to describe her experiences. Unlike formal autobiographies written by mystic women, these letters leave us without any kind of narrative life history. Now, given the method and structure of the spiritual exercises, with its required practice of taking narrative stock of one's entire life, there is really no doubt in my mind that she experienced this form of spiritual narrative practice. And yet, undertaking such self-description clearly required a new way of being and seeing the self in the world, in which Maria Josefa was untutored, or perhaps more accurately, just beginning to learn. Accordingly, the documentary record Maria Josefa left us remains tantalizing but very circuitous. Or perhaps I should say that the circuitousness is itself tantalizing. This circling back on the self that I have up here leads me to argue that in this union of Christian asceticism with the technology of writing, we are witness to a wide-scale emergence of a particular science of the self that contained both renunciation of self and the constitution of self within the same spiritual practice. The microspace of Maria Josefa's letters allows us to see something of a transition from the moral theological to a more modern style of psychological reasoning. Now we could, and I have elsewhere, used much the same framework to discuss the letters of a different 18th century woman, a nun named Petra de San Gabriel. However, tonight I'm only going to introduce enough of her narrative to give you a sense of why I'm digging more deeply into Jesuit devotions pertaining to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. My beloved Padre Agustin, so Petra de San Gabriel, a nun at the convent of Santa Ynez, began a letter to Father Marcos. Such words of adoration were certainly indicative of love and passion, and while it would be mistaken to read it as a love letter, Petra de San Gabriel was certainly unequivocal in her letters about her need for constant priestly attention. Yet invocations of the heart had multiple meanings in the context of spiritual self-understanding. In fact, the heart played a distinct role as the seat of the self in the medieval and early modern periods. The book of the heart referred to an interior space that, by the Middle Ages, Eric Jager argues, came to be identified with the hidden or private self. If well prepared, the heart could receive the imprint of God's grace. To have God write his words upon the space, then the heart must be made ready, as it was often described. And this is a description that holds from early to late medieval period, early modern. First, with a knife, he begins to clean the parchment of fat and to remove all gross filth. Next, with the pumice stone, he smooths away all hair and sinews, without which the script will not be legible or durable. Then he applies the ruler to serve as a guide for writing, all of which you also must do if you want to have the book I have described. This parchment book shall be your heart. So the parchment was also inscribed with one's sins. The book of the heart served as one's conscience. Sins and faults were marked in the book of the heart to serve as a moral record of the life of a unique individual, of course to be read at the final judgment. And increasingly, imagery of moral record drew upon language of accounting and private record keeping. A 15th century author counseled women, "Your heart or conscience is a book wherein you shall read during this life, for it is the book whereby you shall be judged." Further, the heart was also the site where one's experiences were held. In this context, the heart held the more subjective, emotional side of a person's life, feelings, imagination, even the senses. Here the heart was linked to memory and to the emerging genre of autobiography that was written, quote, from the heart. The individual became both the reader of the heart and the writer of the heart, both the holder and the interpreter of this hidden and undeciphered self. Thus, Eric Jager concludes, the book of the heart was a crux for all anxieties about writing, truth, language and desire, identity, and the body. And finally, the heart was a palpable symbol of the intense relationship between a confessor and his spiritual daughter. Fernandez de Santa Cruz, the bishop of Puebla in colonial Mexico, this is a 17th century example, offered a very powerful testament to symbolism of the heart in spiritual father-daughter relationships when he made a gift of his heart to the nuns of the convent of Santa Monica. This organ was to be entombed in the convent chapel. In a eulogy preached at Fernandez's funeral, mourners were exhorted to embrace the heart as the living center of love, palace of the will, the most noble part of all those that compose the living human. So equipped with some of these particulars about the heart as the seat of religious being, we can begin to understand the traditions that Petra drew upon when she spoke of her heart in letters to her spiritual director. Petra expressed her special relationship with Father Marquez in terms of the heart. She wrote that he knew her alone and appreciated her heart, indicating his special knowledge of her unique, secret self. If we take all three meanings to be operative here, then Father Marquez was helping her to know God's will, what God had written on her heart. He also knew her sins, as we might expect, given this relationship was based on the sacrament of confession. And finally, he knew her as a person, her hidden thoughts and emotions. She had allowed him into her heart. Together they read her heart in an effort to improve herself. In this sense, Petra expressed the totality of her relationship with Marquez when she wrote, "Dearest Father of my heart, you are the keeper of my soul." Petra is a very fascinating character. She probably would have been considered less spiritually advanced than Maria Josefa, but as a personality, she just leaps off the page as a human being engaged in this kind of sputtering spirituality. She struggles to find her direction, and specifically to find a spiritual director who can, in her words, console her wicked heart. And you can read more about Petra and Maria de Josefa in a forthcoming article in this April's History of Religions. But in the few minutes remaining, I want to move really quickly from Petra's language of the heart to sketch the outlines of where my heart-shaped research is headed now. That's the image that you saw on the poster. This is the Sacred Heart of Jesus, marked as Jesuit by the presence of Ignatius on the left, and most likely Luis Gonzaga on the right. Yeah, that's right. It's actually a very small work. It measures about 16 by 12 inches. It's painted in oil on copper plate, so it's very small and flat, and it's really a lovely painting. I saw it last spring at an exhibit in Mexico City, and it was displayed above a writing desk, indicating that it's meant for private devotion in an intimate space. Now, José de Páez, the Mexican artist who painted this version of the Sacred Heart, was an exact contemporary of Petra de San Gabriel and Maria Josefa. What, if anything, I've started to ask and explore, did an image like this have to do with Petra's discourse of the heart? Well, in a very blitzkrieg fashion, I'm going to wrap up my lecture by suggesting that the Sacred Heart was the external manifestation of this inward turn. Iconography like this makes visible how, in the early modern Catholic world, care of the self was linked to transformation of the world. So we're pulling back the lens again. Now, just this past week, I've been reading through a text that makes this abundantly clear. In the 1730s, a Mexican Jesuit named Juan Antonio Mora translated an edited book on the Sacred Heart that originally had been published in Rome in 1726. The original author was a French Jesuit named Joseph Galifet. He was keen to establish a feast day dedicated to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. His book described how, in the late 17th century, Christ appeared to Marguerite Marie de Alacoque and asked her to promote devotion to his Sacred Heart, specifically linking the devotion to veneration of the Eucharist. In this story, Jesus hands his burning Sacred Heart to her. Now, since then, Galifet proclaimed the devotion had been taken up not only in France, but in places as remote as Canada and China. And in what must be Juan Antonio Mora's revision of the text, it reads that now it was time to increase this devotion among those living in New Spain. Of course, devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus predated Alacoque's mystical experience. The text finally addressed that point some 36 pages in. But this late acknowledgement of precedent actually works to set up what is new, and in my mind, Ignatian, about the form this devotion took in the early modern period. As you'll see, I really couldn't have asked Joseph Galifet for a better setup for me than he did when he began to discuss precedent. He talked about three notable Catholics who were especially devoted to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. First, he quoted St. Bernard, who described Jesus' heart as a place to inhabit. Purify me of all my faults, Bernard prayed, so I am worthy to inhabit your heart all the days of my life. Next, Galifet turns to St. Gertrude, a 13th century Benedictine nun, to whom Jesus offered his heart as temple and cloister. My heart is to be your temple. My body is to be like the cloister, where henceforth you shall live. Now, Gallifet's final example came from the 17th century Ursuline nun, Marie de l'Incarnation, whose experience of the Sacred Heart was critically different from both Gertrude and Bernard. Not coincidental, as I see it, was this French nun's familiarity with the Jesuit exercises. The excerpt Gallifet chose to highlight literally reverberates with Ignatian influence. In a differently inflected language of the heart, she expressed her desire to move outward and to missionize others. The Sacred Heart of Jesus was clearly not a dwelling place for Marie de l'Incarnation. She wrote, I want to go around the whole world, looking for souls to be redeemed with the precious blood of my beloved spouse, and to have them satisfied by your most holy heart. My God, don't permit it to pass that Jesus will be for one more moment unknown and ignored by so many souls. Here her words echo the reflection on global redemption, found in the meditation on the two standards. Her life story as a nun who traveled overseas to New France serves as a testament to the call that she must have heard in the words of the divines when undertaking this exercise, let us work the redemption of the human race. Recall that during this exercise, one stood in imagination alongside Christ and under his banner on the verge of departure. But by the 18th century, the Sacred Heart of Jesus was itself the banner. The heart, no longer a dwelling place, was a blazon that signified Jesuit-inspired hopes for a universal Christian empire and the personal aspirations of a woman like Marie de l'Incarnation to participate in a worldly Catholicism. Thank you very much.
So we have a little time for questions. So Michelle, I'll let you just go ahead and field the question.
Assembly?
Thank you for your lecture. I really appreciate it. I just had a question as far as, I know your research delves deeply into the idea of spiritual capital, but it wasn't really mentioned here tonight. As far as my studies with Mexico goes, there was a systemic, caste system in that day and age. And so as far as people's devotional processes and, this monasticized retreats and whatnot, to not talk about how women and indigenous people were sort of, not allowed to vote, not allowed citizenship. What else? There was not allowed in the workforce, nobility and ordination. So to be rejected, to be, to be separated from that and using Catholicism as a way to be invited, essentially, is quantifying standards to what's human and subhuman. I just wondered why that wasn't really talked about in this presentation. I know it's very deep in your research, the idea of spiritual capital.
Right. I guess I use the concept of spiritual capital to interrogate what's at stake for people when they undertake devotional exercises, right? This particular talk today, I look mostly at these elite practices. We're looking at women in a Mexican convent. We're looking at a woman in a French convent, and so on and so forth. One of the ways I try to shift gears to see what's at stake in undertaking devotional practices that I think reaches a wider and larger scale is looking at evangelical itinerant missions that the Jesuits undertook to more remote places in surrounding colonial Mexico, or the Valley of Mexico. And here, I don't really have that much time to go into it today, but it's really quite fascinating the way that component parts of the spiritual exercises are taken out. Like this general confession in particular is something that the Jesuits take as a small piece and try to instill this wherever they go on these evangelical missions. And what I'm really looking at, and I will bring up this concept that I said I wasn't going to talk about, of consolation. When people are suffering, what was so actually appealing about the Jesuit message? What was it about this this new sort of pedagogy about narrating your life as a sinner? What was that? What was at work there? That's what I'm trying to get at. So the problem of doing this in the colonial period and really trying to get at indigenous voices is really problematic, I have to say. One of the really most problematic things is this concept Indian in the first place, right? It's used in sort of a free-flowing way. It doesn't actually get to sort of like the texture and tenor of the actual people that are kind of maybe underneath that nomenclature. It's a real flattening name. You see Indio everywhere, and within the same Jesuit priests, perhaps writing. Some Indios are very spiritually advanced, and they should be an example for these fallen Spaniards. And within 2 seconds later, in the same letter, still with the name Indio, without this sense of context or differentiation, then, God help us, how are we ever going to save these poor Indios who are so far from God? So that's one of the problematic things. You have to be careful when you say things like citizenship and so on and so forth. This is the kingdom of New Spain. It's not somewhere where anybody gets to vote, anybody from top to bottom. So there are different levels of investedness and status for sure. But it's actually a really interesting society for the way that these caste boundaries are actually very fluid. And I think there's more study about how actually, through an investment of some form of like spiritual capital, people of various different, what we might call ethnicities and so on and so forth, really moved up around. There's a lot of fluidity that really is in that system. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I really enjoy your lecture a lot. I get the kind of heart-to-heart side of it. I guess the bit I struggle with a little bit is how these women in a particularly situated place conceive of a global Christian empire, or how do they, in kind of contemporary Protestant pietist circles, they have these kind of letter days where they have missionary reports coming in about, kind of progress reports of various parts of the world. And is this similar, or how do they move from that kind of conception of a local place to a bigger...
Right. The Jesuit letters are something that's actually quite fascinating. The Jesuits write the annual letters. Some of them are published formally or circulate in manuscript. And one of the places that one of the locations through which they circulate were convents. So they're very popular reading. So both, there's a locatedness to women in this time period that cannot be denied. Even if you're a woman who's not in a convent, the chances of you going out on that ship are nil. You're not getting on the ship. I think it maps out, this sort of global imagination maps out into a lot of different things. One really interesting place it maps out onto is the instances of bilocation in convents, where women have visions where they bilocate to, say, New Mexico, or within, I've seen letters within New Spain where women left the convent and grabbed Ignatius's arm, and they flew to another town where they preached together, and so on and so forth. So there's a heavy sort of imaginative motion there as well. But the spiritual capital concept I'm working with is something that looks at how women who undertook these spiritual exercises, then through sort of this kind of piecemeal grassroots way, tried to make them available to other women. And this wasn't something that was spearheaded by the Jesuits at all. They were saying, hey, we really like the women, the wealthy widows. We like their money to go to our colleges. We don't need these houses for spiritual exercises for the laity. We don't need a house for women in particular. But, gearing up with some lead Jesuits in like local locations or smaller locations, they really did push this through. It's a really interesting story. Mm-hmm.
I was very struck by that hand image and the exercises that one had to go through, and because I don't know much about this period, but I was very struck that the middle one, it demands writing of one's narrative or confession, and because I can imagine spiritual exercises, all this meditation and talking or whatever, but the mandate to write a narrative. It reminds me of WSRP. We have to come up with that next chapter every time we meet. But he said that so I can understand that in a monastic context. But when we look at that, and you talk about the monasticizing of the laity, and I know the examples that you found in your box and such are all nuns, but when I think about the laity, and not even the indigenous, not in New Spain, but in Old Spain or Europe mainland,
Right.
Do we have any evidence that the lay are writing these narratives? Do we have that kind of evidence?
Well, yeah, we do, actually. I mean, how widespread it is something I actually, for non-Jesuit educated laity. See, because a lot of what happens is that a lot of these are directed to the boys and young men who are being educated in Jesuit universities. And so you do see, if you go back to this other image here, that the proliferation of that, with all these leaves, these are all Jesuit colleges around the world by the middle of the 17th century. So if you're thinking just about young boys undertaking the spiritual exercises, it does have a wide reach. The Jesuits are very keen to adapt their methods to the capacity of whoever they're meeting. And so in some of these evangelical itinerant missions, they do specify, like, he was a man of capacity, or she was able to write, so we asked her to write her confession. So I'm looking at, like, the narrative form of confession in both writing when it was available and when it wasn't. I still am interested in how it's a sort of shift in consciousness to say there's a narrative exercise that you actually need to go through in your mind, even as a person who doesn't have access to this book, who doesn't have access to writing. Bomi.
I thought, first of all, thank you for a very heartfelt lecture. I thought that your argument about the epistemological shift was extremely interesting. And I was wondering if you could give a little bit more background in terms of, like, whether the argument pertains to that the Jesuits themselves can be located as like kind of transitional figures, between the sort of moral theological to like a more scientific psychoanalytic discourse, or whether there's something actually within the practice itself. It seems like there are like different levels of approaching, right? And then the practice is like your little what is it, this spiral, that there's something actually happening within the subject. So I mean, the question then is larger, like more like structural transformations versus like maybe also like the question of internal, subjective transformations.
Right. I mean, I think that's why the more I looked at the spiritual exercises themselves, just the meditative practices and techniques within them, it became pretty crystal clear, as I said, that there's not something new here. It's not suddenly like, hey guys, here's a new way of seeing the world. This goes way, way back into Hellenistic techniques that take a Christian turn, as I say so sloppily. But I really have been looking at the way, and if I was going to draw more lines, it would have been a very narrow and very long line stretching way back, right? And then by the time you get to sort of like the late Middle Ages, you see it sort of widening and grabbing onto like a wider range of people. And this is a story that's sort of told within Protestant narratives, I think. And the way you talk about this expansion is you look at, say, something like the modern devotion, but that's always north-facing. You're always facing Northern Europe in that way. And there's no story of how this actually works in Spain. There's no sense of how this actually works in Latin America. So this concept that I have of like this public being sort of monasticized is a way of saying, well, what's actually new? Now, I think the Jesuits are doing something new with their intense worldly focus, that they're really out. They really are out in the world in a way that other orders prior to that were beginning to be, but not in the same way. I mean, this notion that we're not monks, that the world is our home. It's not just. It has institutionalized effects. There's no singing of the mass. You don't have to go back. There really is no homes. Homes were made. They started to develop these professed houses and so on and so forth. The colleges then became kind of like these structures of. They kind of bounded them to a spot and so on and so forth. But when you really look at the way these Jesuit colleges were mapped around the world and you start tracing the way people moved through them and ideas moved out of them, mobility is such a huge part of the story. So I think that these monastic techniques and the mobility of the Jesuits, boom, that's, yeah. Frank?
Michelle, a great lecture. Thank you very much. A little I've looked into the connection between the exercises and the Jesuits, as you know, would be in Asia, particularly India.
Right.
Kind of back and forth. And as I think I may have told you once, I kind of came to a point of failure that on the one hand, you clearly have the Jesuits themselves doing the exercises and also sharing them in various communities, as you so well pointed out. And on the other hand, they're doing this vast cultural adaptation, Vichy in China, and so on. And I could never find, but I haven't read the letters and so on, any kind of explanation linking, because we do the exercises, we're able to make these transitions to wider audiences, or because of the exercises, we have this great imagination.
Yeah.
Did you find in your research that they talk about how the exercises enable them to do the inventive things they did?
You know, there's not so much self-conscious discussion of the exercises. They're kind of like, they make them all the time, and so they never talk about them in some ways. It's sort of, but what does interest me in making this comparison between Asia, what's happening in Asia, and what happened in Latin America is precisely this notion of adaptation, where you have people like de Nobili and Ricci sort of taking on the garb of the Confucian garb and the Brahmin garb and so on and so forth. This never happens in Latin America. This absolutely never happens in Latin America, or very rarely. I mean, the kinds of accommodation are really quite different. The Jesuits in Latin America constantly have their black robes on, and I think there's something really unique about the Latin American experience in the really tragic way, in the sense that this massive population destruction through disease and so on and so forth pretty much obliterated a good part of the population. So, when I'm teaching a class like on Christianity and colonialism, we start in Latin America and I say, well, let's look at these same guys at the same time period. When they go around the corner to Asia, it's a completely different story. They have to adapt to what's over there, where the Jesuits in Latin America really never did. They did talk about, in Latin America, about, and Jose de Acosta does this also, about, well, who's really ready to undertake the spiritual exercises? And this is part of his discussion of native culture at the end of the 16th century. The Franciscans had a really millenarian view of, this was going to be fast and furious. And Jose de Acosta comes in, it's been a century now, and he's like, we have a cultural problem here. These people, we need to work with them so that they can become human, as he says. And he sees that there's this is his tripartite structure of society, and who's ready for this, who's not, what work do we have to do to get everybody ready, and so on and so forth. Anybody else? Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for being such a nice audience.
Thank you. We invite you to have a little more food and drink, and then to see us again on April 1st for Roni Yivshai.
Food and drink.